What if every experience, every hardship, every obstacle was given to you, not to break you, but to mold you and strengthen you? What if the center of your suffering was actually the key to ultimate health? And what if your own pain was meant to be the catalyst for your greatest purpose? Welcome to Buddha Belly Life, empowering purpose, mind to microbiome. Welcome to the Buddha Belly Life podcast. I'm Coach Britt, and today I am joined by Star Edwards. She's a clinical support liaison with Microbiome Labs, which is, if you don't know them, they are leading some of the most cutting edge research in the microbiome and gut specific supplements and education. And so she's here today to give us some awesome science, you guys. This is going to be a little different than you're normally used to, but you're going to love it. So welcome, Star, to the podcast.
Thank you, Britt. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. And we were talking, before recording and I was saying she's so good. Like you really, really know your science, Star. Like she leads so many things. Sorry about that. My puppy gets a little loud. She leads so much research and things like that I don't even know how she does it and articulates it so well. And so today, being on the podcast is a little different because she's usually behind a slide and stuff like that. But you guys are in for a treat today because this is going to be some excellent education, whether or not you're a coach, aspiring coach, or just an individual that follows us. You're going to really like this. So Star, can you just tell us a little bit about like your background, like about you and kind of how you got into this work? Did it just kind of fall in your lap and it just was a job? Or did you have some kind of like vested interest or experience in this arena?
Yeah, so my story with nutrition really started, I think, growing up with my mom. Hi, Mom. She was totally into every fad diet I think there was. So I saw her, I always say she cooked so much tabbouleh and ate so much tabbouleh that she started sweating garlic. And I remember when she was making mushroom tea, kombucha, but we called it mushroom tea. And I was scared to death of it. I was intrigued, but I think I just kind of walked way around it and tried never to get very close to it. And when I went to college, I was going to go into journalism, but the first year, all the journalism classes were full. So I just took a semester to find classes that seemed kind of interesting, and Nutrition 101 was one of them. And it wasn't one of the fun nutrition classes. It was like memorize all the vitamins and minerals and their RDAs and take tests over it. But it was intriguing to me. I really began to put together that there was some science behind this diet and nutrition stuff, and that no one really knows what they're doing when it comes to nutrition and what they should or shouldn't be eating. So I thought if I could learn that and then go teach people, that would be really cool. So I switched my major to nutrition. I ended up becoming a registered dietitian and working in the WIC program. And at that time, it was, I would say, dietitians were pretty closed-minded about things. And I was pregnant with my first child. And I remember having, right before I went on maternity leave, I had a mom come in with a son, very young son, that had just been diagnosed with autism. And she really wanted to try the gluten-free, casein-free diet. But her doctors had told her that it was kind of silly. There was no science behind it. Mm-hmm. And I was taught to tell her the same thing. But I just remember looking at her, and as knowing that I was becoming a mom, I thought, there really isn't any harm in this diet when it comes down to it. And what if it actually did help her child? Why not? So I helped her with it. And then a few months later, I had my son, and he went on to have some neurodivergent type issues, GI issues, eosinophilic esophagitis. And I think that first encounter with that mom kind of opened my mind a little bit, and I started really researching functional nutrition, and I took a deep dive into it and never turned back, and I've used it to help myself with autoimmune conditions and my son as well. So that's the short story of how I got on the functional nutrition track.
Oh, that is so cool. And what's cool too is actually my mom worked for WIC. I'm so familiar. Yep. She used to teach breastfeeding classes there.
Yes.
And And so it's cool because, yeah, like there's a lot of cool things that come from the program, right? It does meet a need that is not met. And it was really cool because she was very pro breastfeeding, which we know now is like really important. And they would run into issues with doctor recommendations when it came to breastfeeding and stuff like that. So they were actually, yes, they were actually like more advocates of all that. And they didn't even know what we know about the gut, right? They just knew the health of breastfeeding. But yes, having trained in a lot of dietitians and stuff now, we do see a lot of like the food politics are definitely infiltrated in a lot of the RD requirements. So cool for you and like really great for you for doing that. My oldest son falls on the high functioning end of the spectrum. We have lots of neurodiversity in our family, in our home. My husband, multiple kids. We have 6 blended family kids. So I'm right there with you. And it's cool that that's how you started working with this stuff, because you're like a genius when it comes to articulating about gut bacteria and supplementation and all these things. Like, I don't know how you do it so clearly. I could have understanding like that, but to speak it like that, that's why I'm more the entertainer, the conceptual educator. And then I bring in you guys to like do really specific stuff because you do better.
Well, we'll see how it goes with me today off the cuff, not behind the slides. Yeah.
That's all right. Well, you're going to get comfortable. You'll do great. So give me kind of some info, like what we're learning from the gut biome, because in your guys' area of work, and which is why obviously we trust in you guys provide a lot of education for some of our coaches and ongoing graduates and stuff. You work with a lot of clinicians, naturopaths, doctors, etc., dietitians. But Microbiome Labs, the company you work for, you guys are studying some of the latest research on how gut bacteria. So when you talk about getting into nutrition, you were seeing that food had this pull. That, correct me if I'm wrong, was before you understood actually how food and multiple factors, environmental, affects the gut biome, which is ultimately what pulls all the strings in how it would never be an episode if I got away without knocking the microphone at some point in time. I talk with my hands, guys. But so tell us kind of like, can you bring that to life for people a little bit about what we can read from the gut biome and our overall health and symptoms and conditions?
Yeah, so the microbiome is such a cool area of research right now. There's been so much research done in the microbiome lately, but there's so much that has yet to be done. So it's a really exciting field, and what we're learning is what we eat impacts the microbiome, the bacteria, basically, we're feeding them. And then in turn, whoever we're feeding, they're producing specific byproducts that are going to impact our health. So we could feed our more harmful bacteria. They're going to produce byproducts that are going to be absorbed into our body through the blood. They're going to go to every organ and they can create havoc. Or we can, eat healthy fibers, feed our beneficial bacteria, and then produce things like short chain fatty acids that are absorbed into the blood and go all over the body and help produce or decrease inflammation. So the microbiome is so important to our overall health and chronic conditions. And there's all these different pathways and ways in which the microbes can impact our health. But then we have so much influence really over the bacteria and how we're feeding them.
Mm-hmm. And this is a part, guys, some of my coaches will get this, but not everyone gets this. Like she said, like people are confused when they think they eat and the food is directly just what affects our bodies. They forget that there's a middleman. There's a lot of middlemen, women. I mean, who knows? I don't think there's a lot of creatures in the middle of this that are then they're actually consuming the food, and it's their behavior. It's their processing of nutrients and all that stuff that actually is what impacts the health effects or lack of health effects that we see from a good or a poor diet. But like you said, they produce short chain fatty acids versus toxins. This is something I don't think a lot of people understand. I think even some coaches don't understand this, that it's not just the functionality of the gut bacteria, it's the quality, it's the byproducts that they make. So, right? So the gram-negative bacteria are going to produce more negative byproducts than the positive bacteria. So when we have this dysbiosis issue of too much, more pathogenic bacteria and stuff that's not as beneficial, then our body is producing more those bacteria are producing more inflammatory toxins and hurting our body, as opposed to the opposite. If we have more beneficial bacteria, then it's producing these byproducts, kind of like they poop it out, right?
That's one way of looking at it.
Explain that a little bit?
Yeah. And if we talk about those dysbiosis risk factors, so how can we influence what is happening in the microbiome? Well, there's all these things that we do have control over. Just for example, I see all the time when looking at stool tests, chronic stress. When someone's under a lot of chronic stress, it actually decreases the diversity in the microbiome. And having diversity is really important. Diet is one of the biggest factors. If you have diversity in the diet, you're going to have diversity in the microbiome. So the different types of fibers that you can eat, the different types of food, the more diversity you can have in the diet, then the more bacteria you're going to feed, and then you're going to have greater chance of having those beneficial metabolites that we were discussing. And then, of course, we know antibiotics and different medications can impact the diversity in the gut microbiome too. So we do have a lot of control over what is happening in our microbiome, and in turn, in control of our health, really.
Which, yeah, and we have control, but there's a lot of power there. I think people don't even know, and they say, oh, it affects my gut. I don't think they realize, no, it affects the creatures in your gut, and the populations of what you have are going to determine your health. Like, that's a really big thing to drive home. And some of the professionals and stuff, like, they get that now. Not all of them, unfortunately. There's a lot in the health field or, in traditional, typical medicine right now that are naive, but I feel like it's catching on even more and more to, your traditional doctors and stuff like that. So when it comes to, probiotics and how we do that, right? I think if you guys aren't familiar with probiotics and obviously gut specific supplements, like probiotics are going to be how we inoculate the gut and supplementally, right? We take that. But Star knows a lot of really great stuff that we're learning now with different types of probiotics and how they work and other kind of supplements and things like that. So can you give, I don't know if I gave you a great segue for that, but feel free to just kind of take the floor on that because.
Yeah. So when I talk about probiotics, to me, there's basically two different buckets. And what we're used to is taking a probiotic that maybe has a lot of bifidobacteria and lactobacillus and many different strains as possible. And really what we're doing is trying to find something that will stick, something that will work. We were taught a lot of times that if you did have antibiotics or these dysbiosis risk factors, that it impacts our gut in some way. A lot of times we don't know exactly what has happened there, but we do know a probiotic would be beneficial for us. So they've formulated these what I call kitchen sink probiotics, that just as many different strains as possible, many high CFU as possible, and we hope something sticks. Now, there are definitely benefits to some of those, but there's another way of looking at this, and that's where some of our products like Megaspore come in, the spore biotics. These spore probiotics are a little bit different. They are naturally found out in the environment, in the soil. They're not active there, so I wouldn't call them soil-based probiotics, but they're dormant. And whenever a host, like a human or an animal, picks them up and swallows them, they're in an endospore, so they're kind of inactive. But in that endospore, it protects them. They can survive up to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can cook with them, but they're definitely going to survive your body temperature. They survive stomach acid. They make it to the colon, and whenever they use quorum sensing to kind of tell that the environment's good for them, they come out of their endospore into their active form, and they start to work. That's different than your other probiotics because most probiotics don't survive digestion, especially if they're in the refrigerator, have to be refrigerated. They're not going to survive the body temperature. So when they get in the colon and they open up, what they're really doing is working on the environment there. They're creating an environment in which other beneficial species can thrive. And they do that by optimizing the pH, by producing vitamins, some of those metabolites that we discussed. It's like really fertilizing the soil. And some of our spores, Megaspore, for example, there's 5 strains in there, but I always say you get so much more than those 5 strains because they actually help bifidobacteria and lactobacillus grow. You have to have the correct pH and the correct environment for any of your commensals to thrive, and that's what Megaspore does. Other types of probiotics, there are some benefits to them. There's single strain, single use type probiotics that have been studied for more kind of like a prescription. You have this condition or this symptom, and we know that this probiotic has been studied to be beneficial in those conditions. And sometimes I think it's beneficial to take those alongside Megaspore. But most of those they don't arrive alive and ready to work. They're what we call postbiotics or ghost biotics. They are dead, but they confer some benefit while they're there. It's just as they move on through, they're not going to stay there and continue to work. The benefit's only there while they're being digested.
Do you have a desire for fulfillment? Does helping people tap into their own health mentally, emotionally, and physically fire you up? Do you believe in the impact of the gut microbiome on overall wellness? You may be an HWCA coach. For more info on our cutting-edge health coach trainings, visit hwcacoach.com.
So sorry if you don't mind, I'm in a layman's terms, some of what you said, just a little bit for people. This is where I'm good. I'm like, and I love how I think you delivered that beautifully, but just in case anyone missed that, and please go back and rewind it, like pause it. Like, this is good information. This isn't always just something. Sometimes podcasts, like, they're fun to listen to. You're just listening, but some are going to be loaded with great information. And this is one of them. So when she's talking about why, like, this is why we choose spore-based probiotics. And just to preface this part, you guys, this is not just like a promo for a brand. This isn't a paid thing. We don't get pay or kickback or anything by choosing to work with this stuff. We literally are in the work of gut health and gut restoration. And so we've found through our own research that this is some of the most effective and sensible probiotics and ways to do gut inoculation that I've ever seen. And that's why we align with them, and they have great education, and it's some of the cutting edge research. That's why spore-based probiotics are a thing. So what she's saying is that what typical probiotics, and I think as us, more is better, right? So you go get a probiotic and it's like something billion, CFUs and blah, blah, blah. And this, all these strains and, things. And so people think, okay, great, this is really going to help my gut. But what she's saying is that you're kind of shooting in the dark. And I think when I'm done with this little spiel, we should talk about sometimes the dangers of shooting in the dark that we're seeing now too, something to be mindful about. But she's saying that basically these species aren't going to really live through the body most of the time, but they'll be transient. So they'll just pass through, and you may be seeing some benefit, but it's kind of like you're just going to get the benefit as they're passing through. So you're going to keep needing to take them, as opposed to a spore-based probiotic is kind of like planting a seed or an egg. Let's say an egg, right? I mean, correct me if I'm kind of steering in the wrong direction, but I always think of it as kind of like planting a little egg, almost like if you have soil, if you've ever done tried to make compost or something, you plant little worms. Well, imagine you planted like the baby worms, and then they get bigger and they start fertilizing the soil more, and they start tending to the ecosystem, and they get to be big earthworms, and they just enrich the soil more and more and more, and they're going to protect from certain, invaders and things like that. And they're going to make this awesome soil. Well, that's our biome, right? We need really great soil. And so you're planting with spore-based probiotics, you're planting kind of like these little eggs that then stay in there longer. They're not just transient, and they go to work there. And that is what we're really after. That's what we like about it, is that's a whole new level of gut restoration and of inoculating the gut, especially if we can follow it up with some of the right lifestyle practices too. So on that thought though, when people are just taking, have you ever seen it? People are just taking probiotics, do we see it sometimes create havoc because we don't know what their individual biome looked like in the first place? Like, are they getting the stuff they need? Are they getting too much of stuff they already have? Is this ever an issue? Do you see any of that?
Yeah, it definitely could be. Most of the time, what I see primarily is that they just don't get any benefit from it at all. But certainly, if you are putting the wrong thing in your body, then you can have some kind of symptoms. And I always recommend doing a stool test, a microbiome test. If you have been exposed to those dysbiosis risk factors, then, which most of us have been, go ahead and do the test and see what your microbiome looks like, and then we can create something a little bit more focused for you so that you know you're putting the right thing in your body. And whenever I have someone come to me and say, what do I do about this or that? I'm always like, you need to see what's going on in there first. But we do have research that we've done with some of our Zenbiome products, which is more of a prescriptive strain. It's a little bit different than the spores, but it's been studied as a psychobiotic. And there's been some research when they combine these strains with other strains that they kind of canceled each other out. And some of those strains that were commonly used as probiotics even increased inflammation in the body when they looked at things like inflammatory cytokines. So even though it was being sold as a probiotic, the cytokines hadn't been researched. And when we researched that, we saw that it was creating more inflammation in the body because the immune system saw it as a foreign invader. It was a bacteria that was in the gut, and there was leaky gut, and the immune system kind of just created more inflammation against it.
Mm-hmm. And that seems like a lot of stuff kind of in nature too. Like, these things can be so helpful, and they really are. I mean, I have people that can, I've had them where they can only eat 4 foods, clients and individuals where they can only eat 4 foods, and being able to use the right supplements, like probiotics and like enzymes and stuff like that is the only way that we got them to be able to increase the types of foods they could eat and start getting better. But much like nature in general, I feel like I'm in North Idaho where I am, right? Like I'm like 2 hours from the Canadian border, and we have this lovely issue of messing with nature. And they did something a while ago, like somehow they introduced the wolves, like the Canadian, or wolves that we didn't normally have here originally. And then what happened is we saw that they were decimating a lot of the wildlife, and it was backfiring. And somehow I remember it was linked to finding to a lot of, I think it was moose and stuff being full of worms. So people would shoot game here and they'd be full of worms. I think because they were consuming the feces of the wolves. Gross. But we were talking about poop and biome, so it's fine. and so then they're like, okay, great. We have too many wolves. Now let's go shoot a bunch of wolves. So now let's go give tags and everybody shoot. Well, and it's like, we just keep messing with stuff. And sometimes the same with the gut. If we mess too much, sometimes we need to back off. And I think that's why I like the spores is sometimes it's like, okay, we need to just maybe support some things and then let it recoup. And we can do that with using the spore-based probiotics a lot. And I think, in diet, using removal protocols and feeding, the good gut bacteria, whether it be supplementally or not. But it helps to have someone guide you through this process because, like, for instance, my sister got on a prebiotic and I told her I thought she had SIBO, right? Like, I think this has been an issue. So she went and she started probiotics, and then right after she started this prebiotic, it wasn't you guys. She didn't ask me about it. So just for the record, but God bless her. It's okay. And she started taking it and her gut went wild. And it's actually how she really realized that she probably had SIBO, because she took the prebiotic. And if your gut is really messed up, and depending on what type you take, it can make it go crazy because you're feeding a lot of bacteria that aren't the ones you want in there. Yeah. And they're not in the right spot, right?
Exactly.
So that it can go wrong.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And the great thing about the spores is they're universal colonizers. You're talking about messing with nature. The spores are found in the soil and in people all over the world. So we know that they're supposed to be there. It's not some random strain. We just went out and found these and started taking them. They're universal colonizers. So we're supposed to have them in our gut. And when we take them, they live there for about 21 to 28 days. They go back into their spore form. We defecate them. The purpose of that in nature is that they'll go back into the soil, and they live for millions of years there. So they're supposed to go back there for the next critter to pick up and just start the whole cycle over again. So they truly are different.
That is so interesting to me. Like that's just so cool. And that's like the circle of life, right? Like that's how it's going through. And so cool. So, and when you were talking about other supplementation, so when you were saying how, because you guys do, Microbiome Labs does have more than just the Megaspore, the spore-based probiotic, but like you were saying, there's a time and a place for a specific strain to help aid something like maybe what are some of the cases where you would add something to that?
Yeah, so we've got our Zenbiome products, which are 2 Bifidobacterium longum strains that have been studied for a psychobiotic. We have a strain specifically that shows that it binds to H. pylori and removes it. And it's a ghost probiotic, so it's been studied as a dead probiotic that binds to H. pylori and removes it. So there's different strains that can be used for different things. I think that research, which is what we really specialize in, is researching these strains to know that they do what they do. It's very important.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about like the Zen biome and all that, which I like some of those especially for anxiety and whatnot. But when you talk about it binding to like H. pylori, is there any kind of specific gut issues or overgrowth issues or dysbiosis that you see maybe more in people that have more mental health conditions like anxiety or depression and things like that?
Certainly. One of the biggest things I look for is LPS producers, so gram-negative bacteria. And what that means is that we have gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria in our gut. Gram-negative bacteria have something called lipopolysaccharide or LPS. And it's just kind of there, not creating an issue. However, whenever we eat, it kills off these gram-negative bacteria, and they release LPS. So the LPS isn't released until we eat. And LPS is a neurotoxin. It's just a general toxin, really. And I will say that these gram-negative bacteria, they are killed off more by high-fat diets. So if we have a leaky gut and we have elevated gram-negative bacteria and we're eating a lot of fats, it could really create an inflammatory storm. So these gram-negative bacteria, they release the LPS. And if we've been exposed to these dysbiosis risk factors, and therefore we have what we would call a leaky gut, we're supposed to have two barriers there to keep these bacteria and toxins and food out of our body. And that's the mucosal barrier and the intestinal barrier. Dysbiosis risk factors will break those down. And then things like LPS will be absorbed into the body. It goes to the blood and it circulates to all the organs. So LPS specifically, I always say if you Google any specific health condition and LPS, there's going to be some kind of connection there. LPS goes straight to the liver and it can create some fatty liver. It goes to the brain, and as we were talking about, it is a neurotoxin. So it is correlated to things like anxiety and depression, and it's actually a predictor of depression and other neurological conditions as well. So one of the first things I look for is an overgrowth of these gram-negative bacteria, which we see in dysbiosis, and it's actually pretty common.
Yeah. Wow. And I like how you articulated that really well too. So when I wanted to ask you a really important question. I wish I was so busy listening that I didn't get to write my question down. But so obviously when you're talking about it producing LPS, like we're talking about inflammation. Again, those are the simple things people understand. We understand, poor diet gives us a lot of inflammation, but it's specifically some of these gram-negative. So when you're reading a stool analysis and stuff, you feel like, oh, this is what I was going to ask you. When you talked about high-fat diet being the most correlated to higher amounts of LPS producers, right? Has there been any research done on fat specific, or is it all fat in general? Like, is there a difference between your healthier omega-3, your avocado, your olive oil, and maybe, really unrefined coconut oil and things like that versus your seed oils and burgers and fries and processed foods and things like that? Is there any difference we've seen that? Because I know we always just reference high fat, not keto, not, but is there anything have we seen any difference in how bacteria respond depending on the type of fat?
Definitely. So the standard American diet usually will result in more dysbiosis, and a lot of those fats and the sugars and the things that are in the standard American diet will feed more of your inflammatory bacteria. Unfortunately, some of the research shows that things like coconut oil do kill off more of the gram-negative bacteria. However, and everyone hates me for saying that, but what I typically say is if you have a leaky gut, that's more of an issue than if you don't. If you have a nice, healthy microbiome and intestinal barrier, then you can have a little bit more coconut oil. It's not going to create more inflammation. It really comes down to what state you're in at the moment. But a lot of these bacteria, yes, they like the standard American diet, and beyond diet, digestion plays such an important role, because if you aren't digesting foods appropriately in the upper digestive system, where you're supposed to be. They end up in the colon. And when we talk about the microbiome, we're referring to what's happening in the colon. They end up there to be digested by these bacteria. They're over fermented, and that usually produces more of the inflammatory metabolites.
Mm-hmm. And this can be maybe a little confusing too. So when you're like, these higher fat diet and stuff actually kills off the gram-negative bacteria, that sounds like a positive thing, right? And what we say is, no, when they die, they produce like a toxin, and it kind of poisons your blood and leads to inflammation. But how does it kill them off if they so when we eat, it's killing off this bacteria? Can you explain that a little bit?
I'm not sure the mechanism actually by which it's killing off the gram-negative bacteria, but the fat does kill them off, and then they release the toxin. And you're correct that it sounds like that would be a good thing if we're killing off some of these bacteria, but they're really not a problem until they die and release that LPS.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we don't really know how they die. Is it maybe from eating, or consuming, or whatever? But they die with food. That's so interesting. So interesting. So that's some awesome research, Star. Is there anything else that you feel would be beneficial? And then I do think do you have any extra kind of testimonials and things? I know, because you guys have seen some rad cases, and like just working with people that I've worked with, it was really interesting. And I'm just going to segue real quick on this. When you were talking about reading a gut test, it was fascinating to me a while ago, because obviously we have school and we train health coaches. For a while, we tested quite a few of the coaches. We just did it with the education. And I would help them interpret it. And this is when we were first trying to learn. And I always tell all the coaches, I'm like, you're never going to forever totally learn how to completely interpret one of these tests. The data grows every day, and it's DNA stool analysis, and it's just so intricate. But there's some basic stuff that was, easy to see. And what I thought was really ironic is that some of the coaches, and this makes more sense now that you talk about this, that have lower scores on their overall biome period, had more of the diets that I thought would be more beneficial. And I spent a long time trying to figure out what that was. So those of us who would eat more like paleo, which I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's like, what is paleo to you though, right? Like I always joke, I'm like, it can be really great. I think it's a great foundation, but you could also eat like, bacon fried in butter and wrap it around a sausage that's grass fed and call it paleo all day, and that's not necessarily exactly what we're getting at here, high veggie, high fiber and all that stuff. But anyways, they ate more like that, lower carbohydrate though. So that was the thing, more healthy, but lower carbohydrate, and they had lower gut scores. And what really clicked for me with that is because we probably are not, some of us, and it was me included, it was me and a few of my coaches, that are not including enough of the really preferential carbohydrates. Because if you are eating lower carb like that, which I do better on a lower carb, it's, but I have to make sure that I'm eating enough stuff like that, like my sweet potatoes and all that kind of stuff, and really getting a lot of and getting a lot of those foods, the roughage in there to meet my protein content, and not overdoing it on fat. Otherwise, it really is easy to eat a lot of fat. So that would make sense. But you're like, I'm eating pretty darn clean, and that would make more sense why we were getting lower gut scores. And then what was really interesting to me is that the students who had the higher carbohydrate diets sometimes had a little better gut scores, but more symptoms of discomfort. And again, something else I thought about that too was probably if they have any state of dysbiosis, they're probably eating higher carbohydrates. We couldn't necessarily identify exactly what kind of carbs those were. And the students who weren't having as many symptoms, but had the lower scores, one of my students specifically said that she has a low tolerance to certain foods though. So if she's not totally in line, then her gut goes wonky. Yeah. So even though it seemed like she had good, symptomology, she was very sensitive to it too. And I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. So one of the really cool things about the test is seeing what kind of foods and diet would be best for your microbiome. If you are eating paleo, you can see what it's doing to your microbiome. And like you said, paleo can be interpreted many different ways. And it's important that we still have some fibers in that paleo diet, because I've seen it over and over create some imbalances in the microbiome, because the microbiome wasn't created to thrive on a paleo diet. And I do think sometimes it can have its benefits, but we have to be very intentional about how we are doing the paleo diet and how we're feeding our microbiome.
And it was cool. It's just random. I think Dr. Mark Hyman a while ago wrote a book. He called it the Pegan Diet. He like coined that. And I was like, he's really, I think he's really getting somewhere with that. Not that like a diet is for everybody, but his point was the thing that we liked about paleo for gut health is that it focuses on, if you do it well, if you understand it, then it includes lots of high nutrient dense food, and proteins and clean sources, right? Grass fed, not your commercial junk and all that. And it removes a lot of commonly inflammatory foods or things that not everyone digests well, like just lots of grain and flours and things like that, and dairy, processed dairy, and all that stuff. And so it was like that was really great. But the problem is that people were lacking enough of the whole food. So when he said vegan, he was kind of like putting vegan, if you were to do vegan, a really healthy way too. Okay. Don't even get me started on the called potato chip veganism. Like those different, but the high whole food, like, plants, lots of plants with some of the, and you put that together and I was like, that is so spot on. Like, really was kind of getting there. Not that everyone's the same, but I think that's why he said that too, because the biome needs more. And I think that's what I've learned personally, especially with my level of stress. And a lot of people that I've worked with in the coaches, I think that's excellent insight with that part.
Yeah, and one of the best things you can do for your microbiome if you are on a keto or paleo diet is try to include like a Red's powder or some more berries that tend to be a little bit less lower carb, but they have lots of polyphenols that feed your beneficial bacteria like Akkermansia. Akkermansia muciniphila is kind of a hot topic right now. It's one of our favorite healthy bacteria, and it really thrives on polyphenols. And a Red's powder is great for that, along with intermittent fasting. So that's one of my easy go-tos for people who are on a lower carb diet to include to really boost those beneficial species.
Very cool. That's great info, Star. That's so great. So as for, like I said, stories or anything, as we wrap up, you got some, you told me you've got some cool case studies and things that you've seen throughout doing this. Do you mind sharing some of this with people so it brings it to life? I think now, if anyone listens to this, they're going to look at their gut so differently. Hopefully this, even coaches, even my coaches, even me, but this drives home a lot more factoids that really dial in on the importance of the gut and like understanding how it functions. So it's not just a concept anymore. It's really pretty specific. So with case studies and some of your experiences, can you share some of that with us?
Yeah, so if we go back and talk about how the microbiome influences, different organs outside of the microbiome, we call that the gut organ axis. And it's kind of like a town square with roads going all different directions from the town square to all over the city. And the town square is your microbiome. And it sends signals all these different roads that go all over the city to different organs of your body. So it communicates in different ways. A lot of them are by producing these metabolites. And we've talked a little bit about the gut-brain axis. LPS, for example, is a neurotoxin. And there's all different ways that the gut can create these pathways with the brain. But I had this really interesting case with our microbiome test of a patient who was female and had a lot of neurological symptoms. She had seizures, fatigue, anxiety, and depression. She did have constipation, so a little bit of GI issues. But as a side note, these kind of tests are so beneficial for symptoms and conditions outside of the gut, because we know that the gut influences all these organs, not just digestive symptoms. So you don't have to have constipation or diarrhea or SIBO in order to benefit from one of these tests. So her main issues were really neurological. And the only thing that we knew about her was that she had well water that smelled like rotten eggs, and she had poor dental health. those would be considered dysbiosis risk factors. Dental health is so important for microbiome health and inflammation all over the body as well. And digestion comes into this because if you don't have enough stomach acid to kill off those oral pathogens, they'll end up in your colon. But remember the fact that she had well water that smelled like rotten eggs. When we started to look through her stool test, we saw that she had a pathogen called Bilophila wadsworthia. Most people have this bacteria, and a lot of times it doesn't create any issues, but when it's overgrown, it can cause constipation, and it produces hydrogen sulfide. So what does hydrogen sulfide do? It creates gas that smells like rotten eggs. And it also can create a lot of digestive symptoms as well. We see it in SIBO too. So she had the Bilophila wadsworthia, which produces hydrogen sulfide. Now, hydrogen sulfide, in addition to your digestive symptoms, it's also a neurological risk factor, especially when it's really elevated. She also had a lot of LPS producers, so we know that's a neurotoxin, and she had elevated propionate. We talked about short-chain fatty acids a little bit. Those are those beneficial metabolites that bacteria produce. One of them is propionate. However, balance is so important because even when the short-chain fatty acids become elevated, they can create issues. And in the case of propionate, it is connected to neurological issues like Alzheimer's and autism. It also increases the production of ammonia, which is neurotoxic. And in addition to that, she had elevated ammonia. So she had a double whammy there. And she had elevated histamine producers, which are also a neurological risk factor. So we just kept kind of combing through her test and seeing that she had a lot of metabolites that were neurological risk factors. And when they compound on top of each other, that could be playing a very large role in her seizures and in her brain fog and fatigue and not diarrhea and anxiety and depression. But if we go back to where did this all start? Well, if you look for well water that smells like rotten eggs, it's from a family called Desulfibrio. And we found that family on her stool test, which is also known to produce gas that smells like rotten eggs. So this bacteria was in her well water, and we saw it on her microbiome test. It was creating some of the constipation, but also really lending to some of those neurological risk factors. So that's an example of how these dysbiosis risk factors impact our microbiome, and then in turn, how the microbiome will communicate with the brain and can create some of the neurological risk or neurological symptoms that we are having.
Wow, that's amazing. And it's good for people to know. And yes, like that seems like the back of my hand, like I get that all day long, but most people don't. And they think gut issues, they think a lot of GI stuff and they don't realize. But for me, mental health was how I got into gut health, was anxiety and depression as a child and all that. And so I totally came in brain first, in my own way, like sliding on my face. Okay. But then you do turn around and you start realizing like, okay, it does affect my gut though too. Like a lot of people don't, they just have more minimal symptoms. They're not loud enough. They're not screaming loud enough for them to know. And they're probably so chronic that it's normal for them. They just don't even know until it gets bad enough. But you can know via a lot of things. You can have really bad joint pain. You can have obviously mental health and all kinds of brain function. And I know you mentioned like, Alzheimer's and autism and all that. And that's why though we focus on the gut for everything, on improving it, because we may not make a condition disappear or something. Sometimes it does. Often it does. But symptoms and how these things play out improve so much. So even if, you have a child like I do, that's on the spectrum, or even things like ADHD or mental health or anything, by focusing on that gut health, we actually can do so much with that. We can do so much with that with any condition by focusing on the gut.
And I would say if we don't focus on the gut, then whatever condition it is, if we can't reverse it, then if we don't focus on the gut, then they're going to end up with worse condition down the road. Maybe, sometimes it's the start of an autoimmune condition, but one autoimmune condition leads to another because it's the same underlying process. And if we don't address that underlying process, it'll just continue to get worse and worse in different conditions. So we can often see with the microbiome, maybe even not a process that is happening yet. Maybe they haven't been diagnosed with something, but we can see the beginning of it. And hopefully by correcting the microbiome, we stop that chronic health condition from ever happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. The body is a warning sign. So whenever there's something wrong, and we're unlearning our typical approach of, okay, what pill or thing can we take to Band-Aid the symptom until it turns into more symptoms and more symptoms and more pills and more Band-Aids, Exactly. So yeah. So this is self-care. I always tell people, I'm like, sometimes it's your blessing. It sucks right now. The only way out is through, but sometimes this is the warning sign that saved you from so much more, and especially our kids. And we need to learn how to see it in our kids, because this generation's got it even harder than we ever did against our gut. So, well, thank you so much, Star. I just want to thank you so much for being here. And you guys, we do have connections to all of this stuff, to gut testing. We have coaches that can do this and everything. So you can, if you're curious about this stuff, there's a link in the bio here, but you can visit buddhabellylife.com. You can look under the holistic gut restoration and all that, and we will definitely get you hooked up. But thank you, Star, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another empowering episode of Buddha Belly Life. For more information on gut health and mindset resources, visit buddhabellylife.com. And remember, heal yourself and then empower others to do the same.